Hi, this is Mike Benoit with Tyranny Busters. And of course, for those that know about our videos, it's about busting tyranny upon the mind of man. And that's what Kelvin Smythe's book should be about that we're going to cover here. And I'm going to be real quick on my intro here and let him take it and tell us who he is and what the book is titled and what it's all about, because that makes the work easier for me. But it has to do with prejudice. And frankly, prejudice is, in a way, work like tyranny upon the mind. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kelvin, and let you introduce yourself and your book and what it's about.
Okay, thanks, Mike. My name is Kelvin Smythe. I actually did used to live in San Diego out there with Mike and some other people. I never met you personally, but we were in touch here and there, active politically. I'm back in New Orleans now. And I actually quit politics after a lot of dealings with Republicans and so forth out in San Diego County. I just was over politics and over some other stuff, and I moved back to New Orleans, and it took me a little while, just sort of time away from everything, to kind of get a different perspective on political ideologies. I really didn't care who was winning or losing, but I was still interested in the news and would notice what was happening. And after a while, I saw lots of different. Well, I saw the same patterns occurring over and over, specifically with how left-wing ideology is constructed. And we'll get into the details as we go along in the interview, but basically it always came down to being in favor of one group and being against another group, and having that being the total defining drive behind the whole ideology. So I started writing my book, and I think, when it looks like a formula, you can start to explain a lot of the other stuff that they say and they think that to us, or whatever we are. I mean, we'll get into what the differences between me and Mike later, but it just seemed to explain a lot of how they think, and to me it was like the ideology had sort of been solved in a way.
All right. And actually, that would be a good place for me to come in with my first question, because it is on that topic that you just shot on there and you just explained or opened up. You said the first half of your book explains liberalism completely. And quite frankly, when somebody says to me, well, they're just liberals, or that's liberalism, I go, well, what the heck do you mean by that? Because I'm sure if you asked 100 or 10 liberals what liberalism is, you'd get 10 different answers. But you say, in short, it's liberalism is a prejudice against any big social identity group and in favor of any little social identity group. What do you mean by that?
Well, people always talk about how they're sick of identity politics. Well, the concept behind identity politics is that you take away people's individuality and you just look at society as these social constructs, like black people or Christians or poor people or Muslims or gays or men or women. And these are really abstract concepts to people like us who think in terms of how society is supposed to be formed around individual rights. But it's a different concept on the left. And I don't think it's codified or anything like that. I think it's just a natural way for us to think. We think in terms of groups. And when you do that, you can always construct a situation where one quote unquote big group is the reason for the victimization of a quote unquote small group. And so you get into this one sort of basic concept of how politics is supposed to be, I guess. And the end result is that you can blame certain groups. You can create blame and you can create division. And whenever you can do that, you can create political power. So I don't think it's necessarily like some master plan that somebody came up with. I think it's just how people tend to end up thinking, like you were saying before, like the tyranny of the mind. And I think that people people think they're supposed to be in charge of society, therefore they take the side of the little group and defend against the big group. And it's a closed-minded concept.
Kelvin, you kind of touched on an example a little bit, but I'd like you to elucidate on that a little more. Now, a big social identity group. You want to give me one, and then a small one, and so we can, you know, sort of parse this prejudice that you might say that the liberals have in that regard. Like, give me a couple of groups.
Yeah, for sure. Like the white people would be the big guy and black people would be the little guy. Or, I mean, I'll give you three just really quick. We can talk about whichever one you want. But, you know, to back up my point, look at the narrative of all democratic politics. They'll say the white people are the enemy of the black people, and that turns into the Black Lives Matter movement. And then you have the rich people against the poor people, which is slightly more legitimate, but that turns into the 1% movement. Or you have the men oppressing the women. The men are the big group and the women are the little group, and you have the war on women. So I mean, whichever pairing you'd like to discuss, we can go for it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see the first pairing. What was your first pairing again? When you
Blacks and whites.
blacks and whites. So you're basically saying that the liberal whites would be, say, in favor of or espousing the idea that the white race owes the black race something.
Well, it wouldn't just be the liberal whites who think that. It would be anyone who thinks in terms of left-wing ideology would think that whites currently owe black people something more than political equality.
Okay, so, and you think that's a dogma of liberalism? That would be an interesting question to ask people who identify themselves as liberalism. Now, how does that manifest itself in, say, a political situation? Do you think that they think that, say, blacks should get reparations, but that means things like welfare and social benefits, and whites shouldn't? Or how would that manifest itself?
Well, I would take a different, for instance, like you're just going to see that you're going to have different different rules applied to different people based on what their skin is. The best examples for blacks and whites, I think, still is the Mike Brown, the situation in whatchamacallit, Missouri. What's it called again?
Oh yeah, I forgot the suburb, but
Yeah, we'll remember it in a second. But you know, if you look at the specific information of what happened up there, you'll see that this person tried to rob a store, and then he got into an altercation with a police officer where he could have just surrendered, and he didn't. He ended up being killed, and most of the, you know, even the grand jury and even the Department of Justice said that everything that the police officer's side of the story was correct. So rationally, we would look at that information and just make a judgment about an individual situation. But when you kind of zoom back and make it political, then the liberal prerogative is to side with this one political identity. So then not only did it turn into, okay, he's innocent, then it went even further and said that, well, it was probably white people's fault. So you're creating all these irrational ideas in people because they're siding with one political identity against a different one.
how did you come up with that conclusion? Did you interview a bunch of people of different stripes, different colors, that said they were liberal?
No, but I mean, you can see it in the news. I mean, they all have the same, they all follow the same storyline on any of these particular issues. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed a lot of people on the left who are saying oh no, let's just look at this reasonably. It was, I mean, yeah, they do when they're pressed, but they're just really reluctant to, because they the whole dynamic behind this prejudice and sticking up for the little guy and being against the big guys, ultimately it creates political power. And I don't know if that clicks for you right away, but I mean, I would ask you, how many liberals have you seen who've just sort of said, oh no, let's look at this completely objectively. Mike Brown was definitely guilty. I don't think you would find a lot, and I don't see it on the news.
Well, I don't know what people's stripes were. All I saw was things on discussions on Facebook going back and forth one way or the other. So I don't know what their political persuasions were other than that. But, I have a different take on a lot of this stuff. And it's, my take is, first off, grand jury is not supposed to decide the facts of the case. If the grand jury is just supposed to decide there's enough here that this should go to a petite jury.
Yeah.
And so I found fault with that system, with the system there. I didn't observe firsthand myself what happened there, and whether or not, I would conclude that the cop had to kill Brown because it meant his life or Brown's life, or a possibility of that. So, all I see what is fed through the different sources. And so I know that dropping any prejudices, that these things are supposed to go through a system and a process. And I don't think that happened. And I think if it had happened, then we wouldn't have seen a lot of the reactions that we did see. So, and I think some of their cause for angst, and I say there in this case, meaning the black community, is that not just that they're nailed because they're, and I'm on their side because they're the little guy and the big guy gets them, but the way justice has been meted out, it hasn't been meted out exactly fairly on the basis of black and white. So, and there's a prejudice within, say, a police force. If you're walking down the street and you're black in these areas, and I've seen people discuss this in the media and the news, that's enough for suspicion, because this is a high crime area and this is a black community, and so we can check anybody and everybody where. So you're suspicious and you're black, where they don't get the same treatment if they're white people walking in their community, of being suspected of a crime. So I don't think logically people could say that the justice system has been equally fair to the black race as it has the white race.
Well, I mean, I think that's a more rational question. No, I mean, for a lot of different reasons that are uncomfortable to talk about, the justice system is not as, a lot of these systems aren't the same for black people as they are for white people. But that doesn't excuse us from being rational about each and every individual situation that we come across. And when I look at the Mike Brown situation, I wasn't there either. And I'm not sitting here trying to prove a negative to you by researching a million pages of news stories about it. But, the general narrative behind that particular story was that Mike Brown was wrong. And why would he get a trial? Or why would the officers have to go on trial if they didn't do anything wrong? That's the point of the grand jury system. So, I mean, it's not necessarily like, do you think that there are generally less advantages for black people? Okay, that's zooming out from specific information. It could be true, but it's zooming away, and it's starting to side with group identities. what we would need to do with the Mike Brown situation is forget all of our preconceived ideas about any of this crap with whatever race and just say what really happened. And that's as close to the most accurate information as you can get, is on an individual situation by situation level.
Well, yeah, and you can only do that though at a trial. And so, you know, the grand jury decided facts, and they're not supposed to do that. Is there enough doubt here that facts should be submitted to a jury?
But then what would be the point of a grand jury? Well, what did they do wrong? Because, I mean, isn't the point of a grand jury is to protect people before they go to trial for no good reason?
Grand jury is not supposed to say, well, yeah, this guy's guilty, he should go to trial. This guy's not guilty, he shouldn't go to trial. That's for the jury, the petite jury, to decide. So there is, you know, a killing, and there's questionable circumstances in it. Then that's enough to say, okay, we should have a trial here. You know, it's like they're finding a verdict of not guilty by saying no trial. And I think that no matter what side, from what we saw through the media, from what side, you should have a little bit of a doubt. Well, was that killing absolutely necessary? And then you obviously were sitting there in a jury for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. You get to see all the facts, and then you can make a more educated choice or decision on it. Now, it takes 12 people to find somebody guilty. So, but at least it goes through the process. Maybe 8 people think he's guilty and 4 say, no, not guilty. But it goes through the process, and we, as a civilized society, we accept the results of that process, because that's better than dog eat dog, everybody, you know, retaliating themselves for something that goes. So
I guess so. I mean, I don't know why we would even have a grand jury if that wasn't also part of the process. I mean, the grand jury serves a purpose too.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I thought I explained that, but we can let people make comments about that and,
okay,
and maybe move on. Now, address something else a little differently here. When I hear people use the term liberal or liberalism, and I hear it from the right, I'm hearing, well, like, what do you guys mean? What are you guys talking about? Are you talking about socialists? These guys are socialists? Or are you talking about the gun grabbers? Or, you know, what are you actually talking about here? Because if they use the term liberalism, they can dodge the fact that they might be a conservative socialist. Instead of saying, you know, I hate socialism, you know, I hate what liberals and liberalism stands for, but they're not pulling out the concept that I know mostly came from the right and has now been sort of married into came from the left and has now been married into the right, but this idea of socialism. Even on the right side of the spectrum, people are saying that, oh, I hate socialism, but then you ask them about individual socialist programs and they're in favor of that.
Which kind of social programs?
Well, like Social Security.
You mean like politicians or just regular people?
Regular people on the right, or farm aid for, you know, agricultural aid for the farmers, and a lot of people on the right there. So I think that they dodge that question by using this term liberal or liberalism, and it's, you're probably fully aware of, that term was butchered or adulterated from its original use in the founding era of our country, where, you know, liberals were just minimal government and you know, maximum liberty people like Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, there are definitely parts in my book where I criticize people on the right. Not, I mean, if you think a social program is good or bad, that's one thing. I think that we'd be better off if we're better at defining what these terms are: liberal, conservative, whatever. To me, you can forget the liberal and conservative label. I mean, I guess I would equate liberalism with left wing, just to keep it simple. And my definition of left wing is anything that creates less human rights as prescribed by the Constitution or the founders or the philosophers of the Enlightenment who discovered natural law and who defined what natural rights were and what the purpose of society was and that kind of thing. To me, anything that takes away people's natural rights is left wing, and that makes people on the right or conservatives or whatever. There's a lot of times they're in favor of taking away people's human rights. And I've even gotten to the point where I don't care what your opinion is on it. We should have more or less, but maybe just more that we're actually speaking the same language. Like, for instance, social conservatives, I think, advocate left-wing ideas because they create less freedom.
Right. And so, you're familiar with the Nolan quiz. It's the diamond-shaped political graph.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, typically when you say the area of less freedom, you've got, it breaks, the chart shows freedom in two categories: personal and economic freedom. Personal freedom is what you can do with your own body, and economic freedom, what you can do with, the money you earn or how you earn it, that sort of thing. So when you find out, when you look at restriction on freedom that way, what's occurred over the centuries is the people that we label left wing now typically can be people that are really high on personal freedoms and very low on economic freedoms. So they would be, in other words, saying that the government should control the economics. You control how much you make, how much you pay somebody, whether or not you get a welfare check, social disability, et cetera, a whole gamut of economic things. And then on the right side, you get that personal issues like, oh no, you can't do assisted suicide, and oh no, you can't use drugs, and oh no, you can't go pay a prostitute for sex. And so restricting what people have because they want to control the world in the image that they see it, that they think it should be in.
Yeah, well, look at all of those issues that you just named, and every one of them would probably still fit this narrative of what left-wing ideology is, which is the big guys and the little guys. And one of the main big guys in our society is Christians. Pretty much every issue that you said that the right would be against, or the conservatives, I guess, would be on religious grounds. Like they would be against assisted suicide, legalizing drugs, prostitution. I mean, you name it. If you can think like if you can think of a situation where people on the left, where liberals are for more freedom, where it doesn't involve offending Christians' sensibilities, then that would be an interesting topic. But I think that the only reason that people on the left, I don't know what they want. I think they just want to feel like they're in control of everything. People, there are moral reasons, there are rational moral reasons why assisted suicide or drugs or prostitution might be bad. But I don't think any of the reasons that liberals are for the more thoughtful rationale for any of that stuff has anything to do with just screw the Christians.
Well,
that makes sense.
I can't agree with that premise, but that's their modus operandi, the reason for wanting to be able to use drugs, because they want to use drugs. But let's talk about the big group, the Christian group in America, and the small group, the Muslims.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, do you think that the liberals are, in general, going to side with the Christians or the Muslims in regards to, say, religious freedom or religious intolerance?
They will always side with the Muslims. They will always be against the Christians.
Now, now the Christians, you're saying they might be against themselves, because the Christians probably break down to a percentage that might be close to 60-40, 40% leftist type like the Pope.
Okay.
And 60%, more rightist type like Billy Graham. So you're saying that left side of the Christian group is going to throw off their Christian biases in favor of supporting Muslims over an issue.
That's still a little different. I don't know. I mean, the left-wing Christian population is not one that I'm too familiar with. They don't, I mean, they're not as vocal or as in the spotlight as the right. I mean, you equate the Christian social identity with the Republicans on the right and that kind of thing. But yeah, generally speaking, I think that, I mean, it's not to like destroy themselves. I mean, they believe in Jesus, and whatever their Christian beliefs are, I bet it would be less than 60-40. But, when it comes to an issue like, when it comes to just the broader sense of what ideology is, they'll always consider the Muslims sort of like small and oppressed and needing extra treatment. And if you can get away with calling the Republicans racist because they have some rational fear of Islam or something, they're going to take advantage of it. It's all about being able to take advantage of little particular situations. I don't think it's necessarily like rational, what's best for society, what's best for everybody. It's more like, I bet I could call this Republican a racist right now for what he just said about this Muslim, like what Carson was saying recently or something like that. And they'll just pounce because it's all an opportunity to kind of like take advantage of people and feel superior to them.
Okay, so let's take a big group, big Christian group, American Christians, and a small group of Chaldean Christians coming from Iraq. Now, this right-wing Christian group, they're typically the Republicans. Do you think they would be against or in favor of helping out through government, the Iraqi Chaldean Christians, or against?
Who would be? The mainstream American Christians?
Mainstream right-wing American Christians. Would they be in favor of, lending a hand to the unfortunate Chaldeans?
That's a good question. There is, I think the conservatives, the Republicans, whatever you want to call them, they have their prejudices as well. And I've heard, basically, when all this ideology stuff gets switched and into bizarro world, it's when the right wing starts talking about their Christian identity. And I've heard a lot of people talking about the refugee situation in the Middle East right now, and they're saying, yeah, okay, we'll help, but as long as they're Christians, that kind of thing.
Right.
So I do think that the people on the right, based on their social identities, will favor ones that are more like theirs as well.
Yeah, there's the biases and the prejudices that work in human beings, and they work, of course, differently, and it's kind of easy to typecast them. I know that through the years I've had to deal with guys that were really politically aligned, but then they wanted to blame the Jews for everything that was wrong. And it's like, just because there's more Jewish people that are in the banking industry doesn't make, translate to all the Jews are bad. And so, and these guys would carry their prejudice forever. And then Then I'm talking with people about the people of the that are anti all Muslims because of what goes on with people like ISIS and whatnot, and then a Jewish friend in particular. And, you know, he's basically using the same bias and prejudice against a group of people, a large group of people, that Adolf Hitler used against people of his faith and background. So,
Right.
you know,
I guess one thing that was interesting, or people might find interesting about the book, is that when the word prejudice, we often associate it with sort of the more prominent examples of it throughout history, like the Holocaust or the Civil Rights Movement or whatever. And I think that, you know, from classical Enlightenment theory about human rights, society is supposed to revolve around all the rights of individual human beings. And the left has somehow co-opted this idea that they're the ones who are against prejudice, when in fact, I've found that their whole ideology is based on getting people to think in terms of groups and to think in terms of pitting them against each other and being angry at one or the other, because it does create power. I mean, it created power for Hitler. And it's just curious that when you do start having this honest conversation about prejudice, it is, I think, mostly on the left and how they gain most of their power, but, you know, it is on the right too. And I see tons of people saying, oh, the Muslims are all horrible. Well, I mean, that's obviously not true if you think about it rationally. So,
yeah.
interesting.
And you get a handful of people, and typically it's a handful of people on the different sides of issues that are the agitators and they're the bad actors, and they get everybody on their side wrapped up in the furor and build it up to a crescendo that ends up being something nasty like the Crusades. And, you know, the rest of the people that otherwise would have just, you know, said, well, they're over there and I'm over here and they're not bothering me, etc. But, you know, the rebel rousers turn it into something different. Now, the second part of your book, I'm interested in you're coming from the viewpoint here that the right-wing ideology starts with the natural law and the Constitution and civil society. And so I don't know if you're tying that into the concept of freedom, but you want to explain that a little bit and then explain what your concept of what the function of the legitimate function of government is.
Sure. Well, when I started writing the book, I knew that, generally speaking, this country was founded on the idea of natural law. What does it say in the Declaration of Independence? I should know this, shouldn't I? Here, I'll look it up. But you know, it's in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence that the nation was founded under natural law.
You got a copy of it there?
Yeah. And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. That is sort of like, even, I mean, I wrote this damn book and I can't even remember, but like I think a lot of Americans assume that the founders kind of invented this idea of freedom and wrote the Constitution. It goes back to throughout history, really, where people were trying to figure out, okay, how do we order society in the most natural way possible? And it goes back to Plato, just generally philosophically. But as time progresses and the Middle Ages start taking place in Europe, this movement comes alive called the Enlightenment, and they had these philosophers, which you've probably heard of, and Locke and Hobbes and these kind of folks, and they actually defined what makes us all equal, what makes us all free, and it's the fact that we get these human rights from nature. We don't get them from other human beings. And I know people understand that on a general level, but that is ultimately the philosophical legacy of Western culture, politically speaking. was sort of this discovery, and that's why it was called the Enlightenment. Although there's art and other things involved in that title, but we are free because we were given our gifts from nature, and as that concept, especially by John Locke, it turns into this entire theory, and it defines the ends of what government should be, really, which is just to protect us from each other, and which is not possible in a perfect state of nature. So we have all of our natural freedom, we have all of our natural rights in nature, but one thing that a state of nature is not going to be able to protect us from is each other, and that is why society is formed. So classically speaking, the only purpose for society is a justice system, basically. And that's in the Constitution. That really is the Constitution. It's other than, whatever the problems were culturally of the day that would have been rectified through time, like the Constitution is a literal representation of a philosophy.
Now, you said that the reason that society is formed, did you mean government?
Yeah.
Okay, because you just, society, it happens naturally on its own.
Right.
The reason they formed government, and the reason that Jefferson laid out that the governments were instituted among men, were to secure those rights. Now, that's a philosophy of liberty. But let's say, what does that mean? Does that mean that to secure somebody's right to life, that government can pass legislation that tells you can't use drugs because it's just
No.
Huh?
No, I mean, you have a natural right to use drugs.
Well, I mean, but if you say government's supposed to protect our life and our liberty and our property, if it's supposed to do those things, then can it protect your life against your will?
No, I don't think so. I think you have the right to do anything you want as long, well, I mean, I don't think, I mean, the theory of natural rights is that you have the right to do anything that you want as long as it doesn't violate the rights of any other person.
Right.
So it's all good. Gay marriage, drugs, prostitution, polygamy, you name it. And I'm not saying I agree with all these things. I'm just having a, theoretical debate about what a natural right is.
Okay. Do you need to get water or something? Or are you okay?
No, okay.
You can rough it through? Well, we'll just go a few more minutes and get some more into your book.
I guess do you mind if I ask you a question?
Sure.
Because this was the theory of natural law and all that good stuff is what I used to think that libertarianism actually was. And I thought it meant maximum freedom. And then when I really did a more academic study of what natural law was, I thought that libertarianism was the most pure interpretation of what the founders created in the Constitution possible. And I've found, as I've gone, through life a little bit more, that I don't understand what libertarianism is exactly, because I think there's a lot of people who have different versions of it. So I would ask you, it's like, what's different, if anything, with your libertarianism and just classical, full-on right-wing, as much freedom as possible?
Well, yeah, and see, the classical right wing, I don't agree with that precept that it's as much freedom as possible, because the right wing throughout our history and this Christian nation, different formed on the colonies were formed with different religious sects, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, or if they weren't the same thing, but so they settled in different colonies because they had disagreements. Penn and the Quakers. So they had this idea, and even the founders, a lot of the founders had this idea: we shouldn't have the central government dictating a religion, but it was okay for the states to have their individual state religions. So it's not so much that was based also on a kind of control, but their kind of control. And just as the liberals make up a bunch of different people and different concepts, and the conservatives or Republicans do, the same thing happens with libertarians. And at the top of the Nolan quiz chart there, the diamond is really the maximum freedom, minimum government concept. And so to be a libertarian, you could say, well, you know what? I agree with everything except I think we should have the war on drugs because if we don't, then the culture will go to hell, da 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 da. And so that's one thing I disagree with libertarians on. And then there's others that'll say, well, there's one thing I disagree on is this idea of open borders. And of course, libertarians really, that really understand the philosophy, are not talking about open borders in the sense that anybody and everybody can come. They're talking about open borders in the sense of if you or I want to invite somebody to come, as long as they're not a danger or a threat to somebody else, then this is, our house too, and we should be free to bring them up. That kind of concept. They're not advocating open borders isn't an advocation of climbing over fences. It's with a gate that's wide enough that people can get through it. And if someone's climbing over the fence, and then they're not a good guy because the good guys are coming through the gate. But if you close the gate, then good guys and bad guys climb over the fence. So, but the idea of libertarianism, and for mine, I'm the purist in the group, and even different than the anarchists who claim to be libertarians, because I've been in meetings, political meetings, like political party meetings, and the anarchists were there too, and they're sitting down to talk about more rules for the organization. And I'll be the only guy not voting for the new rule. And anarchists were sitting there, the people that say they're for no government, but they're sitting there asking for new rules and new controls. So they have this, individuals I found have so many conflicts within themselves that rises up and they fracture off what would be, a libertarian principle. Had a debate with libertarians at one of our supper clubs where they wanted to pass mandatory labeling for GMO companies. They make a law that they had to label the product had GMO in it. And I said, well, that's anti-liberty. That's more government. Yeah, but we've got a right to know what's in the food. I say, no, you got a right not to buy it. You got a right to ask them what's in the food. And but that's where your right ends. You think that you can come in and make a law that prohibits me from buying a product from somebody that doesn't want to label it? You're destroying my freedom. If you're worried about GMO, then there's plenty of places that probably label their product non-GMO. But, so they find issues. I know another libertarian on rent control. Well, his excuse is, well, we should have rent control because otherwise the rents will go sky high because the government limits the number of places people can have mobile homes. Well, so that's the justification to have a non-libertarian principle of people charge what they want to charge. They're free to contract. They make their own contracts with one another without the government interference. So the maximum liberty scale is still in that quadrant with libertarians. Go ahead.
I can see on those issues how you could be ideological purists, but still recognize when you're deviating from it. And maybe, with the GMO thing, maybe people have a right to know what's in their food, whatever your friends are saying their argument. Like, I could kind of see both sides of that argument. But as long as I think if you're sticking to the basic concept that you at least agree upon the premise of the ideology itself, then you can have sort of rational conversations about when it doesn't work for you every single time. Which would be, I think it would be nice to get to that point with people on the left, because I think we have a completely different ideology, and it would be interesting to get to a point where we could say, okay, yeah, you want Obamacare because you want this, but you at least acknowledge that it's taking away huge amounts of people's human rights, don't you? But they won't even acknowledge that. They think that there's no negative side to anything that they do because it comes from them. Therefore, we should all bow down and thank them for what they do for us. But for me, it's gone less from, okay, I need everyone to be ideologically pure, to me sort of wishing that people could speak in the language of ideology in its more rational sense.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, and it's a very dysfunctional thing, and it's a collectivist thing, and it's a group think thing, and that Obama did it, so it's great. This is how bad it is, and I see it from right and left. My barber next door to me here, when Governor Jerry Brown was in office the first time out here in California, and Ronald Reagan was the president at the same time. Okay, he will tell you within almost one breath apart that the economy was great when Gerald Brown was governor, and the economy in the next breath stunk under Ronald Reagan as president.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like, where do you go with that? Now, this what you say about Obamacare, but I hear the right, people on the right marching out, well, what we need to do is have this kind of program like medical savings accounts, and then you ask them, well, what about Medicare? And say, well, we got to have Medicare, even though they fought against it in 1965. And so that inconsistency you're talking about is in both camps. And if their guy did it, then, it's okay. It's a Republican idea. It's okay. It's good. If Bob Dole had his name down as the Democrat back in 96, and what's his name, Clinton, was listed as the Republican, then Bob Dole might have won that election, because that's how these people are thinking with their collectivism. I call it tyranny upon the mind. And what you're talking about, there's a ton of prejudice there. They're just predisposed because they're in that camp. That's their Democrat guy,
Yeah.
So that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah. People ask me, like, sometimes what I think is the answer, and realistically speaking, I don't know if there is an answer. I mean, if it could come from me, then I would say education. I think that kids should probably know a lot more about why this country is what it is, what it means, and what political equality is, and that kind of thing. I don't think a lot of people can have these kind of conversations where they even really know just sort of like the philosophical basics of what society is supposed to be constructed for. And I think I bash the Republicans a lot, and I guess I'm a Republican. I don't know, generally speaking on the right or whatever. But I've never heard any Republicans sort of being able to articulate what the foundation of this country was, other than to say these men who created this country were great and we're free and we're kind of equal. But like, it's got to be more in depth than that. It's got to register with people more deeply, like how this all works.
Yeah, that was very superficial how they expressed that. I gave a Constitution Day talk to 160 students at a local high school, and it was something that the ACLU had as a program, and most of the presenters were attorneys, and I'm not an attorney, but I got in on the group of presenters, and the kids could not answer the most basic of questions, some of the things that we've talked about here. But afterwards, in 1 hour, they learned more than they had learned in the entire several months that they've been, in class studying the Constitution.
Really?
Yeah. And so it was just like, I asked them basic questions, what was the real primary founding document of our country prior to the Articles of Confederation? And one kid out of 160 raised his hand with the answer. And the Declaration of Independence. That's our country's based on that. So,
Not good.
you know, the whole breakdown of government and what the federal government is actually supposed to be doing. You know, the founders had all these different political philosophies, but they were able to iron out a thing, okay, this is all the federal government does. And if we want this other kind of stuff, it's up to us to do it at the state level. And we can do that. And so that's what we're so far away from. And even the anarchists wouldn't even be complaining because they want no government. If the Washington hadn't sucked all the power away from society, here, say we're on that in San Diego, if Washington hadn't sucked all that power out, or Sacramento hadn't sucked all that power out, we'd be deciding here. And because we're deciding and we're paying for it ourselves, and so we decide, that's what the founders, the people talked about, no taxation without representation. They're not, you don't get representation if it's mandated from Washington, D.C. or Sacramento.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the interesting thing I'm going through now too is I'm going through some of Albert J. Nock's work on Our Enemy, the State. And he's, as you and I have broken down society and government, he breaks it down even further. There's society, there's government, and then there's the state. And the state really has a definition that's, if you look at it in its own, it's this definition of rule, of mandate, of control, and not one of governing. You know, really one of governing. If you and I have a dispute over an issue, then we have a government that comes and helps us work our way through the dispute. That's governing, you know, government. The state is a different animal, and that's what we've ended up with here. But most of the states throughout the history of mankind have been by conquest. You know? And
that's
so,
interesting. I've never heard that concept before. I guess that's what they must be talking about when they talk about the statist.
Yeah. Yeah, well, anarchists call me a statist. And so, you know, there's too many lazy people in that group as well as the other groups that we're talking about, that they don't really dig in, think about it, and you know, even have the kind of discussions that you and I are having to kind of test our waters and our own theories and to look at things. They just got adopted some opinion, and they march off and they're spewing that opinion as if it comes from a wealth of knowledge within their head, and it's just something somebody said and they adopted it. You know,
Could be. Could be. I know that. I mean, maybe one thing that was a little bit unique about me was that I never. I didn't care about politics too much until I decided I wanted to. And I decided I wasn't going to tell anybody what I thought about it until I really thought I understood what was going on. And that was probably something that differentiated me from a lot of my friends who ended up being kind of liberal. Maybe the anarchists are the same way. They just sort of wake up one day and say, oh, that sounds really cool. Yeah, do what I want. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
You know,
they see all the evil the state does, so they can't see the actual government happening. They only see the evil, the mandates and the forçation of taxes and enslavement by taxes and et cetera, et cetera. And so that's all evil. And anybody that supports any kind of government is evil. We should do everything by a voluntary basis. Well, yeah, sure, we should do everything by a voluntary basis. But when we can't, or somebody violates the voluntary basis, then you have to have central agreement on how you deal with that.
Right.
So,
yeah. Well, that's why I think that education is the key, because, you know, I'm not teaching anybody a whole lot that's new about society in the second half of my book. People generally, well, here it is, and I'll just hold it up. We'll put some links up at the end or something. I don't know how you want to do it.
Yeah, you can send me the links to put up.
Okay.
I'll put them up on the screen, and then you can say right now where to go, though.
Well, it's called The End of Prejudice, and the website is endofprejudice.com. So that'll have links for the book and whatever else I have, articles and so on. But the feedback I've gotten so far is that people love the idea that, to them, I've sort of translated this crazy value system called liberalism. That's where most of the compliments and so on come from. But the second half of the book was more just sort of like, okay, where did our civilization come from? This isn't something that any of us really need to reinvent. We just need to learn what worked, because it all came before us. America is not a miracle. Well, it is a miracle in some ways, but I mean, it's for a reason. People think of it as just sort of, well, I guess it's America and here we are. Well, no, it's a very important country and it came from these certain ideas, and we're losing the ideas, which is why we're losing the country.
Yeah, and I think the misunderstanding of what rights are is a key thing too, because when you read I read the Declaration and I said, how could people misunderstand this? And I got to thinking, well, when you say you got a right to life, so they're saying, hey, I got a right to life, feed me, take care of me, give me health care, give me a house. So if you had a right to life, actually, and that's all it was, then yeah, somebody's supposed to be doing that because you got a right. But so I looked at Jefferson's original draft to say, how could Jefferson put it out this way so it'd be confusing? And his original draft said that we have these inalienables, and among them are the right to preserve, key word, preserve our life, our liberty, and our property. So the right is to preserve those things. We don't have a right to life, liberty, and property. We have a right to preserve those that we have, like the life we have, the liberty that we have, and the property that we have. And that governments are supposed to secure those rights. Now, whatever the committees, whyever the committees got that taken out of there, we can only guess. I think it might have been too strong a language that the slaves that could have used that as a way to say, hey, I have a right to preserve my life, my liberty, and my property. That's what I'm going to do. But if you put in there, you have a right to life, liberty, and property, then the slaves go, well, I own my coffee cup, and I have a life, and and I got some liberty here. The master lets me go around the plantation. So if you the specific concept of preserving is the basis really of the natural law, and any law made that's repugnant to that is really an illegal act. So,
are you saying that in this one of the original drafts that you wrote, that one of the words included as a right was property?
No. So I kind of like your life is your body's your property, but I just threw that in there. No, he said he used pursuit of happiness, but there's like three. You can do a Google and find it, where there's three of the final version, a middle version, and the original rough. And,
okay.
Yeah, so it's the original rough, and there's a second rough, and then the final version. But yeah.
I was just curious because one of the things that I sort of deduced from my research was that property really is the main right. I mean, all of our other rights are property because we are ourselves are our property. But I just thought because the word property isn't in the actual Declaration of Independence.
Right. Well, you could say property is the main right, but really the liberty to do with it what you want.
Right.
So if you didn't have the liberty to do with it, but you had the property, well, that's too big of a restriction there, and that's what they do now. I mean, everything is licensed and permitted now with all the different levels of government. It's not just, it's like the local governments are doing everything the state and federal governments are doing, and there's 3 tiers of it happening. Even a little community here, the ordinances are, yay thick on what you can and can't do, and most people are not doing them, and so they're in violation of the so-called law. So, and this is a compilation from people of all stripes who are controllers. And I mentioned that where the libertarians wanted to be controllers on the GMO. And I refer to two kinds of people in politics in general, the controllers and the liberators. And far too many people feel that to be in control of themselves, they have to control others.
Yeah. True. Well, there you go.
And that ends up with nobody controlling anything, really, on their own.
It ends up with small people controlling lots of people, small amount of people controlling lots of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and Bastiat refers to it in his book, The Law, as you can have a system where the few plunder the many, or the many plunder the many, or nobody plunders anybody. And, you know, in that book, if you haven't read it, that keys into a lot of the Jefferson writing and the Locke and all of that, and that the only purpose for law is to secure these rights. And when it does the opposite, it's not law, it's a perversion. But people have been duped into respecting these perversions as if they're laws. So pretty soon you don't know the difference. And people come up to me and say, "Can I do this?" And I said, "Why would you ask such a question? Can you do this? Has anybody told you can't do it?" But they're so conditioned that they can't do anything without asking somebody if they can do it. This is the control.
Sure.
All right. Well, I think it's a great interview. And then you send me the links, and I'm still doing some of this, figuring this system out here. But we'll plug in so they can see where to go get your book and everything on the screen.
Yeah. Cool.
All right.
All right. I'll be in touch, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you. And you want to just say something at the close here about the book again, so they got that reinforcement. Where to go?
No, I think if people want to take a look, pretty soon I should have a short version of it out. I know that not everybody can commit time to read an entire book, but I want to send you and post somewhere where anyone who watched this video can a link to either a download, or I'll put it on the website, like a shorter version of the book, because it's easier to understand when it's not just a back and forth conversation. When I can bring people one concept at a time through it, people really enjoy the book and they really get the concepts a little better. So that's about it. I'll see if people want to try to follow up on that.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Kelvin.
Okay, you bet, Mike. Thanks.